Day 9, and we are moving right along with another family connection for Jesus. But this time we are getting to the most critical, most mysterious one of all between Jesus and his Father. This chapter is called Self-Aware. And the author goes on to ask, at what point does a child become an adult? When does this critical transition take place? And of course, it does depend on what country you're in. You ask somebody here in the U.S., you'll get probably a wide variety of answers. From 18, you're allowed to vote. 21, now you're allowed to vote and drink. But if you go back 100 or 200 years during a lot of the textile industry, the industries that were coming about during the 1800s, you ask children back then in England, and they'll say, well, 11 and 12 and 13, they were all working at that stage. But back then, teenage and teenage years, that span that we do say teenagers, that is actually just a recent concept that is basically saying there's a stage from childhood, a stage between childhood and adult. Back then it was just you're a child and then you're an adult. And of course, many of us have already heard of the ceremonial rite of passages for girls or for boys. And at the time, it was for either 12 or 13-year-olds. And this is where we find the passage about Jesus, where he's found himself in the temple and he's finally realizing that something is very different, and he's starting to identify God as his Father. How much did he know? Only God knows. But it is an interesting concept because while it wasn't unheard of for ancient Jewish culture to call God as Father, the title was mostly used in a communal sense that, oh, God is the Father over us all, sort of like the other religions would say Zeus was the father over people. It's not in a personal, close sense. And what is so radical is when Jesus goes ahead and says to Mary and Joseph in that passage in Luke where they have to go back to Jerusalem looking for him, and he says, "Didn't you know I would be in my Father's house?" And you'll see it all the way from beginning to end. He identifies with God as this personal Father. In fact, Abba in Aramaic basically means dad or papa, depending on which culture you're using. But it's that very close possessional way of saying he is mine and I am his. And Jesus is talking to God in such a personal way. The interesting thing is after he's at the temple, we don't hear about him again until his public ministry. And this is an important lesson to take, which is what is happening then? Because for these next 18 years, between 12 and 30, Jesus is learning the obedience of deep personal connectedness to God the Father, sort of like David learned it in the shepherd fields. He learned that closeness through all the songs he's writing and singing to God, and he himself is learning how to hear and be led by God. And Jesus is taking that time in the quiet and in the personal space before anything else happens, until he goes public with his ministry. An amazing lesson for us to see, because this is, in fact, how Jesus wants us to call God our Father as well.